In this video, we're going to talk about the cash operating cycle, and as usual, we will start with the definition. The cash operating cycle is the time, and we measure it in days, that the company needs to recover €1 since they invest that euro in buying raw material until they are able to sell and collect the product or the service after the transformation of that raw material. You can see the full cycle in the sheet. So the first thing that the company does is the buying raw material. And that raw material goes to a warehouse. It will wait in the warehouse until the productive department asks for the raw material in order to start the transformation to convert it into the final product. Once this transformation has happened, the final product usually goes to a product warehouse where it waits until it's ready to be sold. And after selling it, the company usually needs to wait a little bit more until they can get the collection of those sales. Once they get the collection, they already have cash. They have cash to buy new raw material and start again the cycle. The cash operating cycle is related to the production department. And if you remember the exercise in which we were doing the table of the payments, expenses, and cost, this is super close to the cost column. So think about that column while I explain again all the cycle. The first thing we usually put in that chart, in that table, are raw materials. So this is going to be the first cost. The company buys those raw materials, they add them to the cost in the table. Then the company is going to start transforming those raw materials into products. So this is a moment in which we add cost, more cost. Which ones? For example, salaries, for example, depreciation, for example, general expenses, as the electrical power, the water, the phone, and so on. Once all those raw materials have been transformed into a finished product, the company takes that product to a warehouse. And I know we haven't talked about this, but there are also costs of having things into a warehouse. Imagine, for example, that you're renting the warehouse. You have to pay the rent. So that would be a cost, an added cost to whatever we have already. And after all this, if the company wants to sell those products, and we have already explained about this, they need to do some marketing campaigns, okay? They need to advertise the product. So this is the moment in which we will add the marketing cost. Before we move on to the formulas, we're going to see a couple of things that are related to the cost operating cycle and also to the cost that the company has due to that operating cycle. So the first thing we'll be talking a little bit about the warehouse. The longer the company has a product in the warehouse, the bigger is going to be the cost. Imagine that the company is renting the warehouse. It's not the same paying rent for 1 month than 2 months. The same will be happening for the depreciation in case the warehouse is a property of the company. But apart from that, you have also taken into consideration that things that you store in a warehouse can be stolen, for example, or if there is a fire, they can be burned, or if there is a flood, they can be destroyed by water, and everything will be lost. It could also happen that products have been stored in the warehouse for a very, very long time, and when the company discovers they are there and tries to sell them, customers are not interested in them anymore because they are out of fashion, because they are old, so they don't want to buy them. Or they could also be damaged because there's an expiration date and it's already passed. So all this increases the cost for the company. Having a very big warehouse is not interesting for the company. Besides that, during all this time, the capital is blocked. It's stored, your money is stored in the warehouse in the form of a product, a final product or a raw material or whatever. But the company is not getting the maximum profitability of it. So this is not very interesting. Analyzing the cash operating cycle and the components of this measure allows the company detecting if the cycle is okay, is it too long, and where is the problem exactly. There's one more thing we need to talk about before going to the formulas. You have to consider, you have to take into account that each operating cycle, every time the company starts buying raw material, transforming it, and goes until the end, is different from the previous one and from the next one. Okay, so the cost and the time lapses are also going to be a little bit different. That is why you will see in the formulas that we use the average value of the variables, because maybe doing one thing the first time takes the company, let's say, 20 days, and the next time they do the same, it takes 23, and the next time it's not just 19. So that's why we're going to use the average values for the formulas. Maybe you are wondering why do companies have warehouses if they are so complicated, if they are only cost, if there is such a risk of losing whatever you have in them. Well, there is a system that is called just-in-time, and it has been adopted by several companies that they wanted to reduce their cash operating cycle. This is a business strategy in which the company works without any warehouse. There are no buildings, there are no places to store anything. And this way, the cost is smaller, the cash operating cycle is also smaller, and the company is working quickly. The just-in-time is especially appropriate for those companies that work under demand, which means the customer calls the company and says, I want this and this and that. And this is like that because the product or the service that the customer requires is very specialized, and each customer has its own needs and its own requirements. So the company is making a specific product for each customer. And this way, there's no big, it doesn't make sense buying in bulk or buying large amounts. This system has only worked in Japan because this is the only country in the world in which if they tell you that you will receive something in a particular moment in time, they tell you will receive this tomorrow morning 9 a.m., you're really going to get it tomorrow morning 9 a.m. Rest of the countries around the world are applying an almost just in time, which means they have a very, very small warehouse that allows them to start working until they receive whatever they need in order to finish the product or service or whatever. In Spain, for example, we're doing better with deliveries and the punctuality of the deliveries, but culturally it's very complicated for us keeping this kind of system. The just-in-time can lead to a negative cash operating cycle, and we will see this effect a little bit later. Are the ones that offer services, which means they have a very small cash operating cycle because they sell a service and they get the sales collection. So their cash operating cycle is going to be shorter, it's going to be very small. So, as we said before, there are going to be several subperiods. There are going to be several components in which we're going to divide the cash operating cycle. So, as you can see, there's a first period that we're going to call warehouse period. And this is a period that goes from the moment in which the company buys the raw material and it ends when the raw material is leaving the warehouse to be incorporated into the production. Then we have a work in progress period, and that's the time that the company needs in order to transform those raw materials into the finished product. And then we have the sales period, and this is the time that goes from the moment in which the final product is completely finished in the production department, goes to a warehouse, until it is bought by customers. Then we have a collection period, and during this period is when the company is waiting for the customers to pay. If you see the slide, there's one more period. It's the one marked in red, and it's the payment period. During that period, the company is not paying the suppliers for the raw material that has bought from them. But there is a moment in which the company has to pay them, and usually that moment is not as long as the time that the company requires in order to finish all the cycle and to get the money from the customers, which means that the company needs the money from the customers of the last period in order to pay the suppliers of this period to continue working. This is why it's called an endless cycle. It's the cash operating cycle, and it has no end because you continue and go on and go on. To calculate the cash operating cycle, we need to do it in two steps. First, we have to do the turnover, and then we can calculate the days. So the first thing will be knowing what is a turnover. Turnover is the number of times that something happens in a year. For example, when we're talking about the raw material turnover will be the number of times that the company buys raw material in a year. So first we'll be calculating the raw material turnover, which will be the raw material consumption divided by the average raw material stock. And then we can transform that into days. How do we do that? It's quite easy. We just divide 365 days, or sometimes 360 if you prefer taking the commercial year, that's divided by the turnover. And that will give us the raw material stocking period, which means the number of days that raw materials are in a warehouse until the production department gets them. And like that, we will do the rest of the components. So we're going to have a work in progress period, we're going to have a sales period, we're going to have a collection period, and finally, we're going to have a payment period. I'm not going to read the formulas because it does not make any sense, but this is a good moment to pause the video, take your notes, and then continue watching the rest. In the case of a commercial company or a company dedicated to offer services, cash operating cycle is going to be much shorter, as we have already seen. We're going to have 3 sub-periods. The first one, it's going to be sales period, and this is going to include the time that the company needs in order to buy products that the company is going to sell just as they are, or the company is going to buy those little things that she's going to use to complement the service that offers. In any case, the company is not buying any raw material to transform, so everything the company is buying in this part is already prepared to be sold to the customers as it is. Then we're going to have the collection period in which the company is going to get the money from the customers, and then we're going to have a payment period in which the company is going to pay the suppliers. And this is everything the company, a commercial company, needs regarding the cash operating cycle. So again, we have to calculate this in 2 different steps, first the turnover and then the days, but the formulas are exactly the same ones we used before, except this is the shorter version. I'm not going to read them, so this is another good moment if you want to pause the video, take your notes about the formulas, and we will see something else before finishing. We're going to see now the difference between the economic cash operating cycle and the financial cash operating cycle. Let's start with the economic part. The economic cash operating cycle represents the number of days that the company needs to finish the whole production cycle. So as you can see in the formula in the slide, we need to add all the days that are part of this cycle. So we have the days that the raw material are in the warehouse, we have the days that the company needs to transform this raw material into products. This is the days of the work in progress. We have the sales days, which are those days that the company needs to sell the product. And then we have the collection days, which are the days that the company needs in order to collect the money from the sales. Then we have the financial cash operating cycle, and this is the number of days that the company really needs to finance from the whole production cycle. So to calculate it, we do the economic cash operating cycle minus the payment days. But what does this mean? What does this mean that these are the number of days that the company needs to finance? Let's say it with an example because it will be easier. Imagine that you calculate the economic operating cycle and you get 20 days. This means that the company needs 20 days since it buys the raw material until it sells and collects the products. We leave it like that. It means that the company has to finance a full 20 days. This means that the suppliers, the providers, are asking the company to pay in cash. So the company has to pay in the very same moment that is buying the raw material, and the rest of the time has to be financed by other activities that the company is doing. But this is not the most common situation. The most common situation is that the company has some days, some margin in order to pay. So the company is buying now and it will pay in a few days. Let's imagine that the providers are asking the company to pay in 15 days. This means that the financial cash operating cycle will be 20 days in total minus 15 days that the suppliers allow the company to pay, 5 days. The rest of the days are financed by the suppliers. So the company just needs to find financial cash in order to finance 5 days. And this takes us to the just-in-time and the negative cash operating cycle that I mentioned before. Some companies are so good negotiating that they have been able to get an extra long period in order to pay the suppliers. And this means that the suppliers are the ones financing not only this operating cycle, but part of the next one. And this is all we're going to see from the cash operating cycle. I hope this video helps and see you in the next one.